Vehicles like the Bob Semple and the Killdozer are known to millions around the world thanks to both their lasting legacies as well as their improvised designs. However, these are only two examples of many armored vehicles built using civilian or military tractors. Today, we look at one such design as we continue our journey through the early days of Soviet tank destroyer development. Stay tuned as we discuss the story of the HTZ-16, the Soviet Union's Bob Semple. I know the time between the videos on this channel can sometimes be fairly long, which leaves you with some downtime until your next tank fix. Well, thanks to today's sponsor Enlisted, you can fill that time with some gameplay in a World War II multiplayer shooter, which is free to play. I played Enlisted quite a bit and I found it to be quite fun with their unique squad system and the plethora of authentic weapons at your disposal. As you might expect, my favorite thing to do though is to play the tanks, which you can actually see me do in an older video of mine where I played the T-60. Not only is Enlisted free to play, but it is also available on Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 4 and 5, as well as on PC. It's even cross-platform. So while you're waiting for the next video of mine, try out Enlisted using my link in the description and get a free bonus including 3 days of premium time, as well as some orders for troops and weapons to get you started. Huge thanks to them for supporting my content. Now let's get back to the video. In the last episode of this series, we explored the history of the ZIS-30 tank destroyer, which was built on top of what had previously been a tractor. The HTZ-16 was similar in that regard, but as we will see, its design took a different path. As with the ZIS-30 though, it is important to understand the seeds planted by earlier developments which would help lead to the HTZ-16. To do this, we must go back over a decade before the start of the German invasion. With the end of the Russian Revolution, the Red Army now found itself in need of new tanks as what little they had were fairly obsolete. Unfortunately for this new communist military, many of the specialists who previously may have helped design a vehicle to fill this role were now viewed as politically unreliable due to their class or previous position prior to the revolution. This resulted in many early designs being created using foreign exports such as the Vickers 6-ton. For their time, these vehicles were perfectly acceptable, however, production could still not satisfy the demand for tanks. While what could be produced was sent to first and second echelon troops, the desire to mechanize the third echelon would lead to some interesting ideas involving tractors. Though not the first tractor-based tank they would create, that being one built on a Daimler tractor, the Durankov's armored tractors give us a look into the design philosophy of the Soviet armored tractors. The first of these, the D-10, was built on top of a Communar 9GU tractor. An armored hull was attached to the tractor and held together with the use of rivets. These plates were 16mm thick on the front and back, with 11mm on the sides and 6mm on the top. While this isn't much armor for a vehicle of its size, it was similar to others of the early 30s. As for weaponry, the D-10 was fitted with a 76mm cannon as well as a Degtyarev machine gun. This is where we find one of the major flaws in the design, as the cannon was actually mounted in the rear of the tractor with the machine gun facing forward. This is not an unheard of design, but would have severely limited the vehicle's capabilities in combat. To power this armored tractor, a 4-cylinder engine providing 75 horsepower allowed it to move at a whopping 6 km/h on roads and 3 km/h off-road. As you can probably guess, this design had a variety of problems, including an inability to start the engine from inside, meaning if the engine were to die in combat, the crew would be forced to leave the relative safety of the vehicle to restart it. Speaking of the crew, it only had 3, with a gunner, commander, and driver who would have to suffer within the poorly ventilated fighting compartment. Moving to the next vehicle, called the D-11, we find a similar design, now built on the American Caterpillar 60. This makes it extremely similar to the Bob Semple, which was also built on a Caterpillar, albeit a later model. This was by no means an improvement on the previous design, with it featuring a less powerful engine, decreasing its top speed to just under 5 km/h on roads. The off-road performance was increased to about 4 km per hour, but that increase is fairly negligible. The protection remained roughly the same, with the only difference being 11mm on the rear instead of 16. The armament also was the same as the D10, with them mounted in the same way. The shape of the vehicle did change slightly to better fit the different tractor, but this new base came with its own problems. Reportedly, it suffered from issues with the attachment points, with the entire upper structure breaking free from the bolts holding it to the chassis. A third design of these armored tractors was also built and known as the D14. This was, however, not intended as a tank, but rather as an armored personnel carrier, being equipped with 3 doors on both sides and only a single machine gun for defense. This APC was built on the Communar 9 EU tractor and, like the others, was found to be heavily flawed. Something important to note about this vehicle is it was actually the only APC the Soviets would produce until the 50s, which definitely makes it worth acknowledging. Unsurprisingly, given their flaws, none of these were put into mass production, remaining as one-off prototypes. Though the armored tractors failed, the Red Army was able to build a wide variety of tanks and armored vehicles over the next decade, and as we touched on in the previous video in this series, resulted in them having one of the largest tank forces in the world by the start of Operation Barbarossa. Unfortunately for the crews of these vehicles, many were either outdated, had been poorly maintained, or lacked the necessary parts and ammunition to keep them in the fight for an extended time. These factors and many other problems with the early Soviet defense led to this supply of tanks rapidly drying up. This would lead to vehicles such as the ZIS-30 as we already discussed, as well as today's main topic, the HTZ-16. Before we dive into the story of this vehicle, I do want to add a disclaimer regarding the information I used. As with many Soviet vehicles, finding accurate information can be tricky and sources vary wildly, especially when the subject is a lesser-known design. So please bear in mind that this is merely intended as a look into the forgotten design and may contain inaccuracies which are beyond what I can currently verify as fact or fiction. The HTZ-16 would begin its life in early 1941 within a tractor factory located in Kharkov. This plant was focused on the production of the HTZ-NATI tractor, which was primarily used for agricultural purposes, although it also served as an artillery tractor as well as a starting point for the HTZ-5. You might at first assume the factory would shift to tank production following the invasion, as many Soviet factories did at that time. But due to limitations with the equipment, it could not quickly be retasked for this, and the new equipment was instead sent to the tractor factory in Stalingrad. This left the workers in Kharkov in an awkward position. With the Germans rapidly advancing, tractors were clearly less important than tanks, but without the machinery to produce them, how could they build them? Well, similarly to what we saw from the well-known Bob Semple, the answer was right in front of them: use the tractors. By mid-July, their design was submitted and quickly approved, with a production order of 2,000 vehicles being signed on the 20th of July 1941, and with that, the HTZ-16 was born. Featuring an armored hull with 30mm on the front sloped at 20 degrees and 13mm on the side, this gave the vehicle frontally similar protection to many other vehicles of its day. As for the firepower, it was to be equipped with a 45mm cannon, which can be found on most Soviet light tanks of that period, and a DT machine gun. All of this was mounted atop the SHTZ-NATI tractor mentioned earlier, although it saw some significant changes. The fuel tank was swapped to the opposite side to make room for the driver further forward, which allowed increased space in the fighting compartment. The frame of the vehicle was also lengthened and now rode on tracks from the HTZ-5 artillery tractor. However, with these upgrades came over 3 tons in extra weight, and changes to the engine to allow it to go from 52 to 58 horsepower did little to offset this. Reportedly, this resulted in a speed of only around 20 km per hour on roads and 10 km per hour off-road. Problems for this vehicle would not end there, however, with production immediately falling behind schedule just for the prototypes. In defense of the Kharkov workers though, they were expected to have 2 prototypes ready in under a month, leaving little time for error, and so the fact they only completed 1 is understandable. Unsurprisingly, this prototype was not exactly what I described earlier due to this rapid construction, with it being built out of mild steel instead of proper armor, and the sides only being 10mm thick as no 13mm ones were available. The most remarkable thing about this little tractor tank though is not the construction, but how well it performed in trials. For a vehicle cobbled together on a tractor chassis in less than 2 months, it managed to travel 470 kilometers across various terrain conditions. Considering this is more than some actual tank designs, I'd say that is extremely impressive. That being said, as you can probably guess, the HTZ-16 was not without flaws, with a number of them being found during testing. The biggest of these was the engine overheating, which appears to be a common flaw in armored tractor designs. Along with these mobility tests, the gun was also tested with a total of 247 shots fired. This was similarly found to be imperfect, with the gun mount causing shot dispersion and a relatively low 5 shot per minute rate of fire. This meant it would have roughly the same fire rate as the Sherman Firefly as we recently looked at, despite only carrying a relatively outdated 45mm. Reception of the tank by the military was far from positive, but still, without the ability to produce proper tanks, production of tractor tanks would continue until the situation improved. In total, over 1,500 chassis would be produced for HTZ-16s, however, due to the lack of armored hulls, only 142 would actually be assembled, with 33 of those being made with mild steel. Production would finally end sometime after the evacuation of Kharkov. As for what happened to the vehicles themselves, the unarmored soft steel ones were sent to be used as training vehicles, whilst the rest went to various tank units. The largest operator of them was the 133rd Tank Brigade, which received a total of 36. Something I should mention quickly before too many of you comment something along the lines of, "You said this was a series on tank destroyers, but you keep calling it an armored tractor," I can explain. The HTZ-16 is referred to in a variety of different ways, including armored tractor, tractor tank, and improvised self-propelled gun. This last designation to me seems the most fitting for the vehicle and appears to be a common way it has been referred to. The term self-propelled gun may seem more like an indirect fire artillery, however, when it comes to many Soviet vehicles such as the Su-76, this refers not to artillery, but infantry support or tank destroyers when necessary. So for that reason, I feel it fits well into the discussion of early Soviet TDs. Enough about that though, you just want to see how it performed in combat. The first use of the HTZ-16 would occur close to where they were built in the area surrounding Kharkov, with their combat debut being against Italian forces. Many were likely lost during the fighting in that area, with only a few surviving into 1942. Their final use would similarly be in a later battle for Kharkov in early 1942, with that being the last record of their use in combat. It is hard to criticize the design of the vehicle as being the cause for their combat losses, as we see vehicles of all types suffering significant losses during this period. For example, the T-34s and KVs saw even greater losses over the course of the invasion, but to say those were due to the vehicle's design would be inaccurate. As an anti-tank weapon, the HTZ-16 was more than likely a fairly ineffective machine given the crude design and mobility, but the simple fact that it was available when other tanks were not is worth consideration. The gun was still capable of dealing damage to many German vehicles and would have been easier to move than a towed gun. Whether the invading forces used any of these they captured is similarly unclear, but in my opinion it is fairly unlikely, given at that point there would have been a plethora of actual tanks captured which would be available if needed. The Germans did, however, utilize some of the captured unfinished HTZ-16 chassis, making them into regular tractors. Before we wrap up this video, I want to talk about one final tractor tank design created by the Soviets. Built on top of the HTZ-5, this vehicle is commonly known as the Ni, short for Naizbuk, which has been translated to mean something along the lines of to startle and is sometimes translated as terror tanks. These were created in Odessa as supplies of tanks were cut off, causing the remaining factories to begin creating these improvised tanks out of what they had available. As with the HTZ-16, the information on these vary wildly, but we do know that a small number were built, with different sources claiming between 55 to 70 were completed. Sources also vary on the armament these armored tractors used. Some had T-26 turrets modified to mount the DT machine gun, with others mounting improvised turrets to mount 37mm or a variety of other weapons. These vehicles did see combat, but their biggest impact is as a symbol of the fight against the fascist invaders. Several reproductions have been produced and they have been featured in multiple films. As for the legacy of these tractor tanks, they unsurprisingly did not lead to later designs. However, to this day, we see similar improvised vehicles being created in conflicts worldwide. No HTZ-16s seem to have survived the war, but you can find a reproduction at a museum in Kiev, Ukraine, only about 500 kilometers from where they were originally built. Another replica also exists in the UMMC Museum in Russia. What do you think of these sorts of improvised vehicles? Let me know in the comments down below. While you're down there, remember to try out Enlisted using my link to get your free bonus and keep yourself occupied until the next episode. Thanks as always for watching, and to my YouTube members who help support my content. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed it so you won't miss any of my future videos. Or if you need some convincing, check out one of these videos which YouTube has analyzed your viewing history and determined you will enjoy. Remember, the algorithm knows best.